Okay, hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool, good. Welcome. I hope everyone's having a good time at Develop so far. Some nods there. Did anyone see Sally Shepherd's talk yesterday on keeping character designs diverse? It was really good, right? Yeah, I'd recommend anyone checking it out if you didn't manage to catch it when it's uploaded. So my name is James. I'm an artist at Hello Games. I've been there for about 5 years now. And I'd like to share some of the things that I've learned during that time. I hope that by the end of the presentation, people will be able to take away a bit of an insight into some aspects of the art pipeline that may be otherwise unfamiliar, particularly if you're a 3D artist interested in some of the more 2D side of things, or a 2D artist interested in some of the more 3D side of things, or if you're a coder or designer and you have no idea how any of this art stuff works, right? I'd also like to share some tips and tricks for artists to add to their workflows. Generally, these will be things that are really simple, straightforward things that I find useful day to day. And lastly, I hope the presentation gives a little bit of inspiration to artists to get more out of their work. So, by the end of it, hopefully everyone will be keen to get back to their computers and get stuck into some art making. As a brief overview of the presentation, firstly, we'll look at what the art generalist workflow looks like in my experience, right? And then move on to look at some techniques for generating concepts as a non-concept artist. Part 3 will be modeling and texturing techniques with a focus on some modular environment assets before finishing up with some quick-fire tips that, like I say, I find useful every day and that hopefully you guys will too. So what is it that I do every day at work? Well, it's, spoiler alert, it's art stuff for a game called No Man's Sky. My role at Hello Games is that of an art generalist, so I work on things like environments, props of varying scales and levels of complexity, creatures, and a whole bunch of other stuff in between. And No Man's Sky, it's a science fiction exploration game set in a procedurally generated universe. It's originally released back in 2016, and it's received numerous updates and new content since that point. And at the time of release, the Hello Games team was really very small, and it's grown a bit, but it's still quite small today. And there's only really a handful of artists working on No Man's Sky, so it means there's plenty of work to go around. So what does that work look like for an artist like me? It looks a little bit like this. So typically, starting at the top of this chart, we'll work our way through each one of these stages to end up with our finalized in-game art assets. And as you can see, I've sort of tried to indicate on the chart that some of these tasks are more or less on the creative side of things, whereas others are a little bit more on the technical side of things. That's just my subjective interpretation of those tasks. Some people might find rigging to be incredibly creatively liberating, right? But that's up to them. So each of these stages is it's a fairly significant undertaking in its own right. And some of you here, maybe from larger studios, so may be familiar with this, that these stages can be carried out sometimes by an individual in a specialist role. So why, might you ask, would you want to do all of that work? Well, the answer to that for me is threefold. So firstly, poor life decisions on my part. Perhaps some of you here have, like me, a bit of insatiable curiosity into sort of how things work. And so through investigating and exploring different art making techniques, you've ended up with skills distributed across all areas of the art pipeline. Secondly, I don't have a choice. Not really, I do have a choice. It's exciting and interesting. Like I say, Hello Games is a small team, and it's quite common in smaller teams that individuals have to wear more hats. So there's always new work, something new to do. And lastly, I like a bit of self-punishment. Not really. It's really rewarding. It's very challenging, but it's very rewarding, right? I believe personally, there's sort of there's a healthy range of discomfort in our work where we know that we're pushing ourselves to build our skills and improve the overall quality of our art output. The most important thing I think I've learned from working this way is to not try and be a master of everything. I think it's very easy to get carried away with a new project, a new idea that we're going to make the best artwork ever and that every stage is going to be executed perfectly. But instead, what I found is it's good to temper our ambition away from trying to make some perfect thing into more of a drive to consistently execute our work to the best of our ability. An analogy that we use at work that gets thrown about a bit is this idea of 100 pots. So if you have 100 days to make a pot, generally you might find that you'll get a better result by making a new pot every day for 100 days than you will from spending the whole 100 days making one pot. It's that process of iteration, right? And I think this is really important for growth. We get more out of our work that way than we do by burning ourselves out on like overambitious or unrealistic goals. The key, I think, is like trying and failing and trying and failing until we find what it is that works for us to get the most out of our time and the most out of our efforts. And one area where that's the case for me is concepting, which, like, as a 3D artist, is absolutely not my area of expertise, but it's somewhere that during my time at Hello and through the support of my colleagues, I've managed to develop, which is the name of the conference. So let's have a little bit of a look at that. So first and foremost, in order to have good concepts, we absolutely need to have good reference. And I believe personally that reference should be three things. It should be relevant, usable, and visible. So what are you talking about, James? When I say relevant, our reference needs to inform our design process. And good reference, I think, does that by answering questions we have about what it is we want to make. So, for example, like what specularity or what kind of like grunge or roughness is it's going to look good on this material we're making? What sort of shape eyes are going to look good on a creature we're designing? Secondly, I think our reference needs to be like usable. And what I mean by that is like I once heard, I can't remember where now, but it's sort of stuck with me. This idea that there's a real difference between reference and inspiration. So images that inspire us, I think, are what guide us towards what it is that we want to make. Whereas references are images that tell us how to make those things. So you can imagine like seeing this image on the left, you might see it, get inspired and be like, I really need to make like a robotic space witch right now. But it's not actually necessarily good reference because like the character's quite dark, we can't see the details. It's not going to successfully inform our design. Whereas the image on the right is like super boring, super uninspiring. It's like a cupboard door hinge, right? But it could be really good reference for telling us how the elbow on our robotic witch is going to hinge, what it might look like, or the knee, that kind of thing. Lastly, our reference needs to be visible. And this is like really as simple as it sounds. Like you need to be able to see your reference at all times. It needs to be there in your face. It's no good if like you've got some reference images open in your web browser and you're alt-tabbing into and out of your software, and before you know it, like you've been working on your design for hours without having looked at your reference. So there's the software we can use for that. I use PureRef. It's a really good always on top window that you can just drop your images into and yeah, keep your reference in your face where you need it. Interestingly though, I think reference can become invisible by virtue of having too much of it. Again, it's that thing about getting carried away with the excitement of a project. Sometimes we can like grab images from here, there, and everywhere and think this will be cool, that'll be cool. And then before we know it, we've got like a really sprawling reference board that becomes quite overwhelming to identify which of our reference images are going to successfully inform our design. So by focusing on keeping our reference relevant and usable, we make sure that our mood board, our reference board is lean and concise and user and visible. So once we've got our reference together and we've got some cool ideas buzzing around our head about what we want to make, it can be very tempting to want to jump straight into Photoshop, start painting from scratch. And in my experience, that is not the best way to go because when we set out to design something to add to our game, we really want to be focused when we're designing it on answering this question, like, how does this thing look in game? How is it going to look? And in particular, what's the quickest way for us to answer that? And chances are, if like me, you're not painting day in, day out for an extended period of time, then painting from scratch isn't going to be the quickest way for you to answer that question. But thankfully, there are other things we can do. So here we have some examples of biome concepts from a few years back that were added to No Man's Sky, and these are like environmental props that like populate the worlds that the players explore. It's quite important that these environment assets reflect the nature of the planet they're on. So, like some of the biomes, some of the planets, for example, are toxic in their nature. So the very air that the player breathes is harming them, and we want the props to reflect that aspect. So that's important to bear in mind. Looking at these concepts, we can see like they're not the best concepts in the world by any stretch of the imagination, but I think they're pretty good. They're like a good example of some of the lessons I'd learned by doing a lot more disastrous concept work before this point. Firstly, you might be able to see that they're entirely photo bashed, and that's because I learned that photo bashing is way quicker for me to answer that question. How can I come up with some cool designs? How are these things potentially going to look in game? Another important. I'm just going to take a glass of water. So another important lesson that's going on here, I think, is this idea of letting nature do the work. Something that our art director, Grant Duncan, has talked about in previous presentations, and that's this idea that you don't have to look very far and wide in the world to find weird and wonderful things that already work really well as interesting design elements. It's much easier to take those things and work with them as they are than it is to like come up with a cool idea from scratch and try and work with that, but later find that you have to shoehorn it into looking like something that may have developed organically or that does look feasible in a world. Another really important lesson that's going on is this fundamental principle of like small, medium, and large. We refer back to this principle all the time when we're coming up with our biomes for No Man's Sky, because they're sort of designed around this idea of like clumps or patches of natural growth where we'll have a few much larger shapes and props surrounded by an increasing number of medium and smaller size props. It gives kind of like a natural and believable look and feel to the worlds. And yeah, it's an important thing to keep in mind. It's also nice to have the different sized props within our biome clusters echo each other in their shape or silhouette. That's because it helps distinguish the different biomes from one another. So you can imagine a player like walking around in a world filled with these the props on the left, these kind of like quite regular umbrella-like mushroom shapes. They can have a really different feeling exploring that world than they are if they're exploring a world filled with the props on the right, which are much more rounded and sort of bulbous in their nature, right? But you can see, even if we match the colors of the different biome concepts we have there, the props are still really distinguishable by virtue of their silhouette. And that's a really important concept that we'll come back to in a bit. So when it comes to making these things, making these concepts, it's actually like really straightforward and easy. Like anyone can do it. I'm not doing any fancy paint work or anything. It's a really straightforward process. All I'll do is like take some reference images that I think like of things that could look cool, I think, in the game, bring those into Photoshop, cut them out, arrange the parts in a way that I think is relatively visually pleasing, and then I'll use adjustment layers to bring the brightness and contrast of those different cutouts in line, because obviously those photos have been taken in like different lighting conditions with different cameras. And what we're really trying to do is create a sense of cohesion between the different elements we're putting together. So to push that idea of like cohesion further, what I'll then do is this really cheap, dirty trick, which is to apply an oil paint filter. And that sort of, but not really, makes it look a little bit like it's been hand painted. And we lose a fair bit of detail by applying this filter, and our concepts end up looking a bit flatter. But it does a really good job of building that sense of cohesion, like I said before, which is really what we're after. At that point, I will do a little bit of painting. I'll like pick out some highlights, add some soft shadows to sort of nest the parts together a bit better. And then I'll go to town with effects brushes, so like adding some glows, some spores or smoke to kind of make the concepts look a bit more dynamic. And that's really all there is to it. Like you just repeat that process to come up with as many ideas as you want. And yeah, but we can push our concepts further in terms of, you know, figuring out whether they're going to look good in game by doing a paint over. And again, this is a really straightforward process. I'm just taking a screenshot of the environment in the game where I expect these props are going to potentially live, bring the screenshot into Photoshop. We've already got our concept clumps in there, right? So it's a case of just copy pasting them around the screenshot, scaling them in line with perspective, and again, using adjustment layers to bring the brightness and contrast in line so they look a bit more like they're sat in the screenshot. A little bit of painting then to sort of maybe add some debris or some shadows at the base and nest them into the terrain, and that's all there is to it. But you know, they're not convincing that these assets are an engine by like at all, but they do a good job of helping us imagine whether or not these designs are going to work. And we can see there the finalized biomes in game. So that sort of covers coming up with concepts in just using 2D, but we can also use 3D to come up with concepts as well. Here we have some concepts for these kind of robot-type creatures, sort of synthetic animals of unknown origin that sort of a wildlife that players can stumble across while they're exploring the worlds. And like I say, these are done entirely in 3D. They're just like kit-bashed 3D parts that are either already made or made especially. And the real beauty of working this way in our 3D software is that we're not like confined by the regular restrictions we face if we're creating an asset that's going to go in engine, because we're just focused on making a cool design, so we don't have to worry about like vert count, poly count, We can use as many lights as we want. We can use whatever images we want for textures because we're solely focused on coming up with a cool idea. And when we're working this way, trying to get as much variety as we can out of our designs, it's really important to be focused on varying the silhouette. And the reason for that is that the variation in silhouette is much more recognizable as being different between different designs than is like variation in color or material, although that is also important. So by way of example, if we look at this row of concepts in the top right, you can see that you could look at each of those concepts and see they're very different things, right? Whereas the row of concepts in the lower left, they're all sort of very rounded. They're based around this sort of sphere shape, and you can kind of also, you sort of think maybe they're just different sized versions of the same thing. It's like I've wasted my own time, right? Like I'm trying to come up with variety, but all of these guys look the same. So like I say, it's important to be focused on keeping your silhouette different and varied if you're trying to come up with as much variation as possible. On the subject of color, though, these guys are like really fun to make. You can really kind of go a bit crazy with them. You're just like, yeah, trying to come up with ideas for different color schemes that could be cool. And to make these, it's really straightforward. I'll take a concept that I'm not super unhappy with, use a magic wand selection in Photoshop or color range selection, bring that selection to a new layer, fill it with a plain color, and then just like pile like color fills or gradients or patterns like tiger stripes on top, right? To try and come up with something that's cool. And it's as simple as that. Just repeat that process to come up with as many color schemes as you like. And what's really good about this is like you can really go quite crazy with it because the concept is going to tell you when you've pushed it too far. We can see with that one that's like fourth from the right, it kind of has this sort of like retro wave, kind of like Miami Dreams kind of like. So it's sort of telling us that, yeah, there's certain contexts where this color scheme might look cool, but maybe you want to rein it back in now. Here we have those robot creatures realized in game. And to reiterate that point about the importance of silhouette variation, you can see straight away the thing that really stands out is like distinguishing these different designs is that huge, like the component on the back right, which has a really, really big impact on the silhouette of the thing. And that's what your eye and your brain latches onto is telling you that, oh yeah, these guys are different. Secondary to that, probably it's the variation in the head shape. And you probably, like, if I didn't point this out, like probably no one would notice, but there is variation in the shoulder shape as well, right? But because that has really minimal impact on the silhouette, you don't notice it as being a distinguishing feature. Here we have the Leviathan, and that's this huge organic spacefaring creature that the player can find, and it like communicates by telepathic singing, of course, and the player can kind of become friends with it because, like, why wouldn't you want to be friends with a telepathic singing whale? But I think this prop serves as a good example as like a case study of the points we've just covered. So let's quickly go through that. Here we have the reference board, trying to keep it lean, trying to keep the reference images visible by not using too many, and trying to pick images that are very relevant and are going to inform the design process of like, what is a giant space whale going to look like what elements is it going to have, what appendages and stuff. And really importantly, I think as well, this row of images at the bottom, the colors there are all really quite wild and vibrant, but so we wouldn't be used to seeing those every day in nature, but they do exist in nature. So we know we can use those color palettes without risk of kind of our designs ending up looking kind of clown-like or unbelievable. Here we've got some concepts, first pass concepts, and these are done using a mix of the techniques described before. There's some kit bashing of like 3D sculpted parts I've made. There's some photo mashing of some elements from another asset from No Man's Sky, which is the on the right there, the living ship. It was made by my colleague Levy. It's like a really cool asset. It's a real masterclass in modeling for procedural art. It's really good, and that served as like the creative blueprint for the Leviathan, right? So this is like a ship that the player can find. It's alive, and it was important that we try and keep the art direction between the living ship and the Leviathan kind of similar. So they were sort of tied together. So I'm cutting out parts of that design, bringing them into the concept of the Leviathan to maintain that consistency. Here we have color variation options. Again, done using that clipping mask technique, and really importantly, they're using the colors from that row of references at the bottom of the reference board to make sure they don't look clown-like, to make sure they look like things that colors that may have feasibly like developed in nature. Here we have a first pass on the base mesh, putting that in game, really trying to answer that question: how might this thing look in game as quick as possible? And you can see like it looks terrible, like it's sort of dead. It looks like kind of a space skeleton. I don't know. So we push it further. We do a paint over. I think I did a paint over of this, and then Bo, my colleague, did a paint over of that. He's like an insanely talented painter, so he's really good to have his input on this project. And you can see we're adding things like space barnacles and space seaweed to give it a sense of scale, adding in the flesh tones to make it look more alive, not like some kind of dead thing. And then here we have the finalized asset in game and some alternate shots there. So just to quickly recap, when we're coming up with designs, we really need to be focused on answering that question: how is this thing going to look in game? And in particular, how do we answer that as fast as possible by only doing what we need and what works for us? And lastly, reference is super important. It needs to be visible, needs to be relevant, and needs to be usable. So that covers some concept making tips. Let's look now at some modeling and texturing things with a focus on modular environment assets. So here we have a screenshot of a settlement, and these are like these inhabited, built-up areas that players can discover while they're exploring the worlds of No Man's Sky. And one thing that was really important for these starting out was that they should be made from these like modular, reusable parts that the players themselves would eventually have access to as part of the base building gameplay of No Man's Sky. And there was a number of implications for that. So first and foremost, we knew that the parts needed to be cheap, right? Because they're going to be used in these really high concentrations, high frequencies in small areas, like either player bases or settlements. So they needed to be performant. They also, because there's a wide range of parts like walls, roofs, aerials, all these kind of things, we knew they're going to need to fit together seamlessly in like quite a wide range of combinations and arrangements. So they had to sort of have a universal joining system. And lastly, we really wanted them to be able to be used in a way by the player that meant that they looked good, regardless of the player's ability necessarily to design good-looking things. So we had to come up with a system for that. Today our time is short, so unfortunately we're not going to cover the last two. We're going to look at the performance stuff. It's like, boo, performance, right? But I think there's some I think there's valuable lessons there, so let's have a look at that. It's so hot. There's a light, oh my God. So how do we make sure our assets aren't going to break the performance bank? Well, yeah, how do we do that? Oh my God. Right, so early on in the development of settlements, one of the coders put forward this kind of joke that was like, maybe the modular assets could just be a single draw call. And what that would mean is that each wall, each roof, each part would have to be just a single mesh with a single shared material, a single shared texture set. And like I say, although that was kind of put forward as a joke, I sort of wondered in my own weird way whether that might be actually possible. And although in the end it wasn't, we did manage to use a single shared material and texture set for the majority of the parts that a settlement comprises, right? Which I think ended up contributing positively to making sure the settlements performed all right. Is that an alarm? Stop. Now, in order for that to work, it meant that our material and our textures had to represent a really wide range of like surface material qualities. So like metals, reflective surfaces, matte surfaces, emissive surfaces for light. And not only that, they had to be they had to have areas that could be recolorable so that we could have color variation both like between and within our settlements, and that also gave the player the ability to recolor the parts to their needs and wants when they were using them for base building. So trim sheets were a natural choice for this because like they're really great. They can be used on like they can be reused between parts. They naturally tile across their length or their width or whichever way that your trims run, which means they can be used to like cover a really large surface area and texture. And for anyone who's not familiar, trim sheet's just a texture, right? But it's made up of any number of parallel texture strips, otherwise known as trims. I thought I was going to say something else about that, but I think that's it. So yeah, the main difference I think between a baked texture, which we perhaps like is more common, and a trim sheet is that with our baked texture, we can see on our asset there, we make a high poly, we make a low poly, we bake the texture out. So the resultant texture conforms to the UVs of our model. Whereas with the trim sheet, it kind of works the other way around. Well, we'll normally make the trim sheet first, and then model our assets around that, and so the UVs conform to the layout of the texture instead. And we use Substance Designer to make our trims for settlements. Substance Designer, for anyone unfamiliar, it's a node-based, non-destructive texture authoring tool. And because of its non-destructive, node-based nature, it's really great for actually not just making textures, but for making custom reusable tools that we can then use to expedite our texture making process. And that's one thing I wanted to do with for the settlement textures, is kind of make this sort of set of tools that meant that that could be used to make trim sheets really fast, not just for settlements, but also be reusable for future projects. And so I did. And one of the tools that was part of that tool set, in fact, it was the fundamental one, is this a trim template maker. What this is a tool that lets us create a template for our trim sheet in the form of like a grayscale indexed mask. We can specify the size we want our trims to be, the number of trims we want. We can subdivide our trims into like 2, 4, or 8 sub-trims. And then use with these other tools that I made, we can really quickly populate one of those grayscale values with like hard surface details or like different material qualities according to what we want our trim to have. Now, at the core of that tool is a node called Pixel Processor, and it's one of the slightly more advanced nodes in Substance Designer. I would strongly recommend anyone to have a go with it, but I'm not going to go into detail on it today because when I did a demo of this presentation with my colleagues, our animator Sai said, oh, it was a great presentation. It was really interesting right up until the point you started talking about Pixel Processor, when I basically fell asleep. And like, you can't blame him because like, if you look at this, right, it's just absolute madness. But the point I'd like to make is that by kind of pushing myself to explore these more technical aspects of our tools, it was really beneficial. I think as creatives working in like an inherently technical medium, we can often find ourselves in these situations where we've like made something, but we're not really sure how. Yeah, or we can have like a really clear idea of what it is we want to make, but we're not totally sure how to use our tools to achieve that result. Maybe through trial and error, eventually we get to a point where it like looks how we want and we're like, cool, like just never touch it again. By pushing myself to like, you know, explore some of these the more technical side of these tools, I was able to like, I think you open yourself up to these kind of light bulb moments where something sort of falls into place and you understand exactly how the things you're making are being made. And that's super beneficial because it like opens up these new creative avenues and adds an extra degree of intentionality to your work. So I guess what I'm trying to say is like, you know, don't be afraid of the machine, like explore some of the harder, more technical sides of things and it will pay off in your workflow. So we made our trim sheets. How do we now create the models for our modular assets in a way that keeps them cost effective? Well, there isn't really any secret ingredients or magic tricks you can do. It's all about working cleanly, maintaining like good topology to make it easier as you're modeling, and only really making what you need. So as artists, we know that vert count or poly count, depending on your own metric, is an important consideration for making sure that the things we make perform well. And so there's a number of things we can bear in mind while we're modeling to know whether or not like certain verts are needed. So first and foremost, we ask ourselves if our verts are contributing to a silhouette change. These verts are super important because they're doing their like real fundamental role of describing the form of what it is we want to make. And that is essentially like what we're doing when we model something. Secondly, we can ask whether or not the verts are contributing to the description of like a curve or a rounded surface. It's kind of just a special case of the previous point, but it's really important because we know when we're poly modeling, we can never have a truly curved or rounded surface. So we need to be prepared to spend more verts on describing those forms. Next, we can ask, do our verts contribute towards defining a material boundary or a UV boundary or material change? And ideally, if they are, they'd also be contributing to a volume or silhouette change. But that can't always be the case. For example, if we're working on hard surfaces or with trim sheets, and we have a flat panel, and we want like that panel to transition between like being really reflective on one side and then being matte on another, this kind of thing. Fourth, we can ask, are our verts contributing to maintaining good edge flow for deformation on skimmed and animated meshes. It's really important that we do have good edge flow on these meshes because when they're animating, we don't want to deform in a way that like creates artifacts and that looks ugly. And lastly, we can ask, are our verts contributing to maintaining correct surface normals? So we want nice smoothing on our models, like we want our bevels to read well and correct and catch highlights in the way that we want to. If our verts aren't doing any of these things, we kind of should be asking whether or not we need them at all, and at the very least consider lodding them out. So to summarize, what I'd say is that trim sheets are versatile. They can fulfill a wide range of surface material qualities, and they're reusable between assets, so they're really good for things like base parts, environment assets. Secondly, try out and explore custom nodes, custom tools. Explore the more technical side of whatever tools you're using, because it can open creative avenues, and it gives extra intentionality to what it is that we make. And last not least, when we're modeling, it's important to be modeling mindfully and making sure that we're only making what it is that we really need. So lastly, to close out the session, just want to cover some quick tips and tricks for things that I find useful every day and that hopefully you will too. So firstly, make life easier for yourself. Right? That's good. That's a good tip, right? Just make life easy. So every day we have these tasks that sometimes we do every day and that are very repetitive, require multiple steps. Maybe they require multiple clicks. And what we can do to try and expedite these things and improve our workflow is turn them into macros or scripts. For example, in Maya, I'm sure this functionality is available in other 3D packages, but I'm just not sure how. In Maya, we can in our script, there's a little button in there called echo all commands. And this is super useful because when you enable it, it means any action you undertake in Maya, the command for it gets spat out in the log. And we can copy and paste those commands together to make our own little, like Frankenstein together, our own little script that can turn like a really long multi-stage process into just a single click. Secondly, design by numbers. An artist I really like and I've got a lot of time for is a guy called Alex Seneschal. He's a hard surface concept designer. And on his Gumroad, he's got this tutorial called Visual Design Basics. And it's full of these really useful tips and tricks for improving our design skills. One of the important lessons in that sticks in my mind is this idea of 70-30. We've sort of referred to it before in that principle of small, medium, large. It has many different names. It doesn't specifically have to be a ratio of 70-30. The principle is that when we're creating something, we really want to create a visual hierarchy in our designs so that they read well. We want areas of rest that our eyes can move over and end up in areas of detail or noise that sort of act as a little reward. And sometimes if we find our designs are looking a little bit flat, a little bit plain, we can apply this rule to try and improve them. And it can be really as simple and straightforward as sometimes like moving a panel line on a hard surface panel from the middle to the side. It can be as simple as scaling up an individual element in our design, in whatever it is we're working on, to make sure that that reads as particularly important. Or breaking up evenness in like a layout or a texture to make sure that our eye isn't confused about which part it should be looking at. Next, this is just like a really easy hard surface tip that I find useful. This issue doesn't come up so much if we're using Booleans, but if we're like hard surface modeling using bevels, it can come up quite a lot. And what it is if you bevel around a corner, you can often end up with these points that are surrounded by 4 plane transitions. And these are really boring to have as in your primary forms for hard surfaces, because we're really used to seeing them every day in things like houses. We have the 2 walls and 2 sides of the roof. It's just not very interesting. So if you are beveling for your hard surfaces, one thing you can do to try and avoid this is firstly bevel one edge, and then bevel the resultant top edge is like do a 2-step bevel, and you end up with this sort of string of 3 points that will have 3 plane transitions around them, and it's just generally a more interesting thing to look at. Next, unflatten to flatter. When we're working in 3D, we generally don't want things to look flat, right? Unless it's like a deliberate or stylistic choice. So we can do a number of things if we do find that we have things that look particularly flat, there's a number of things we can do to try and make them more interesting. Firstly, we can try and accentuate the form in our model. That's not always possible if we know that if we actually have like a flat rectangle shape, we just leave it as a flat rectangle. We can then do other things. So we can apply a hue gradient. So our color transitions from one hue to another to unflatten it. We can apply it like a value gradient. So we're running from light to dark. We can try and catch highlights better on our flat thing. Like we can do that by increasing the specularity of our material or reworking the model a little bit so that it catches highlights better. And lastly, we can break up the surface by adding noise in one form or another, whether it be like grunge in our roughness map, or just adding some noise to our normal to undulate our surface a little bit. And last, but certainly not least, the most important thing I think I'd like to take away from this session, if you take anything away, is this idea called all the Fs. And if you ever find yourself in your work feeling like flustered or fraught or frustrated, it's really important to fall back to feedback. And the reason for that is like feedback is the absolute #1 tool we have at our disposal as artists. It's vital for growth. And it's not only good for us, it's good for our peers and our colleagues as well, because when we give constructive feedback, it clarifies the ideas and thoughts we have about what it is that makes an artwork more or less successful. So by seeking out feedback, the overall bar of quality for everyone's artwork goes up. It means we're creating more engaging, more inspirational things, which is like absolutely should be our goal as artists and game devs. So that just about does it, I think. I really hope there was something useful for you in there somewhere, and thank you for your time. I was like a real-time distortion. Like I practiced this so much and got it exactly on 45 minutes. Well, there's like 10 minutes left. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please feel free. I don't know if that's good or bad. I can't see. Oh, there we go. Hello.
You mentioned about No Man's Sky being.
Sorry, I think they need a mic for the recording.
Oh yeah.
Hi.
Thank you for the great talk. You mentioned about No Man's Sky art being procedural. How does that fit into your kind of creative process of do you have to relinquish a bit of control when you know that stuff's going to be generated? Yeah,
there's pros and cons, right? Again, what I'd say is like the really important thing to be focused on is silhouette. Like, oh man, like the living ship asset that I showed before that Levy did, he's like an absolute master of this, right? Where being able to make things in such a way where you know that what you're making is like part of a modular sort of design. So you can take and add different bits and you'll still have a consistent design, and they'll all appear very like different. So yeah, silhouette, like I say, is a really important consideration for getting as much variety as possible out of your designs when making procedural assets. Right.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, because you do so many things, do you ever feel like if you spend too much time on a specific task further down the line, let's say of something more technical instead of something more creative, when you eventually go back to the creative task, do you ever feel like you need to almost catch up with yourself and need to like relearn some things? It's almost like when you take a holiday and you come back to work and you're like, I don't even remember how to work anymore.
Yeah, it's really interesting. That's actually something that like, yeah, all of the artists talk about when we move on to doing new things. It's a thing that happens, and it's like an extra challenge, but it's a good thing, right? Because I think it's similar to that thing of getting feedback. Like when you move between different tasks, you're reiterating and you're reinforcing the things you know. Like you can forget them, but then when you do them again, it sort of comes back, and you can kind of learn. You learn the things you already know in a new way, which I think is really beneficial. I hope that like answers you a little bit.
Hi there.
Hi.
You mentioned creating your, what do you call them, trim sheets, your trim sheet tool, and creating it in a particular way that will make it work for future projects.
Yep.
Do you have any thoughts on how you go about that without just like rapidly increasing the cost of building the tool?
Right. Yeah. So that is that's like a real thing. It is difficult. Like the more I've worked on these tools, like added new things for new projects, it's true. Like Substance Designer like takes more time to chug away at getting through all the different steps. Equally, I'd say that I think as I've worked on these tools more and more, I've also learned things about how to do things in a better way. So there's a bit of give and take. Like, yeah, it gets more expensive in some ways, but you learn to optimize certain aspects. So yeah, it's a bit of a give and take.
Cool. Thank you. Good talk.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I had a question about the assets used for photo bashing. Do you have any suggestions for websites to get such photos from? Especially if you maybe want to like post them online later and you don't really want to infringe on copyright.
Yeah, for sure. Like that. Yeah, again, that's a real thing. Like, so Google search is really good because you can do like the, you can filter it to be like Creative Copyright, Creative Commons license, which means that like you should just be able to use them. It's a really interesting topic right now, especially with AI, right? But yeah, use your own photos. Like it is the best. Like Google's there and it's amazing, but yeah, if you want to be absolutely certain that you're able to like share these things later, like to avoid all risk, just use your own. Sorry, I'm shielding myself because I can't see anyone.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm just wondering, how long did it take to create the first library of assets for the first launch? After you've figured out the process, I guess the process took a long time to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, that was before my time. So I started in 2018. The game was released in 2016. So exactly how long they were developing, I couldn't say, sorry. But on that subject, what's really interesting is that like, so when we look through our source for our assets, the history of like who's made each asset is there. And when we look at like through all the older stuff, there is a lot of assets. There's a lot of content in there, and it's very impressive to see how few names are like on those lists for check-ins. Like the Hello Game team when the game was released was real small. So what was the question?
How long did it take?
Oh yeah, so how long did it take? I don't know.
Did you use version control?
Sorry?
Did you use version control? Like, did you have a lot of?
Yeah. We use version control. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, I don't know how long it took, but it didn't have a lot of people making them. Like, there's a lot of stuff. They didn't have a lot of people. So yeah.
Yeah. Great talk.
Thank you.
You mentioned briefly about optimization with set pass calls, draw calls. I'd like to know, looking back now on the development cycle, is there something that you'd like to implement, or you thought you could implement, or wish you did implement for optimization purposes?
Oh, like on specifically the settlement parts, or in general?
Let's say settlement.
Yeah. So I think when we first did settlements, there's three different types, right? There's three different styles of asset that a settlement can be. There's like these stone ones, there's wooden ones, and then there's these kind of more high-tech metal ones. And I started out, when we started out, I made stone ones. And I was really very conscious about vert count. So I was very like hard on myself in terms of like making sure that I used as few verts as possible. I think if I were to go back and we could afford it, then I would have liked to have like modeled in some more detail and like, yeah. But we can't.
Hi there. You talked a bit about model optimization, vert counts, all that. Do you use any lodding in the game?
Yeah, we do. Yep. So, yeah, we use a range of techniques for optimizing our models. They range from some automated processes to manual lods as needed. And sometimes we often we remove parts of models completely, and we also use different rules for No Man's Sky is on a lot of platforms, so we, depending on what the platform is, we sometimes have different lodding rules as well to match the hardware specifications that we release to.
Great, thanks.
Cool. Thank you very much. Cheers.